This episode is made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 103 of the Inktofilm podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss the 1812 Brothers Grimm fairy tale, Little Snow White, and Walt Disney's 1937 animated adaptation, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So James, I think this might be the oldest story we've ever covered. But then I realized the Scary Stories a few weeks ago might have something to say about that.
Yeah, I think they're both, I think Brothers Grimm collected short, like folklore stories as well, and this is kind of the same way.
Yes.
So they're who knows really how old these stories are.
Well, that's the thing. I was doing some research into it, and this fairy tale is definitely older. You know what I mean? It was collected by the Brothers Grimm. They didn't create it. Now, I'm still going to give the nod to this as our oldest publication because the book that we're talking about came out in 1812. However, it was later revised several times, and then the edition I think that you can buy nowadays was the 1854 edition, but still quite old. Whereas, obviously, The Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark came out in the 80s.
And it's German as well, right?
Yeah, German, which was later translated to English. I'm actually not sure about the English translation when that came to be. But yeah, this is old stuff. And I'd always heard that the old versions of the Grimm fairy tales were a lot darker, and that held true for this one.
It did. And you know what's funny is I was like, nearing the end, I was like, this really didn't get dark. It kind of is the same story. And then it got dark.
Well, I would argue there was a pretty dark thing right in the middle there too, which we should definitely talk about. But before we actually get into the specifics, I think we're going to talk about a lot of history in this episode. This is going to be kind of an unusual episode, which we should maybe talk about a little bit first. Yeah,
well, I just wanted to address the fact that these are like folklore stories, and this in general, this story. Something that came to me was just that, like, this movie specifically, it feels like I came out of the womb having already seen this movie. Like, it's it's that ingrained in
Probably
society.
Probably because your mom watched it when you were...
Probably, yeah. When I was just a twinkle in my mother's eye.
Yeah, there you go.
Callbacks. It's so ingrained, right? Like, it just feels like the fairy tale.
Yeah, and I remember having that, like, classic white VHS holder for the VHS copy of this, which I think those are actually worth a lot of money now. I was seeing someone posted online. I don't know how much, but if anybody still has them, I think they're actually worth quite a bit if they're still in good condition, I suspect. Mine are long gone, I assume. But yeah, I remember having those exact copies of a bunch of animated Disney classics.
And that's my preferred way of watching film, I think. If I can get like the newest release on VHS, I'm just like, great visuals, great sound, we're in.
Yeah. Watch it enough times and it wears out and starts having lines and stuff. Those are the good old days.
Oh, VHS.
Our younger audience might not even know what that is. Before the DVD, way back in the early years.
Back in my day, we had to rewind the movie.
Yeah. Man, that's funny too, because like in the history of these stories, like that's all very new though. Because think about it, 1812, like it's hard for me to even comprehend. Over 200 years ago, these brothers were collecting these old fairy stories, and going like, oh, these are these old oral history stories. I want to collect them and put them in a book that I've been hearing. Similar things that Alvin Schwartz did with the Scary Stories, right? Brothers Grimm did it way back then. And the stories were old in 1812. It's wild. And
they feel that way, like I kind of said. It just does feel like, I'm sure we'll get into it, but like some of the characters and some of the things that happened are so cliche at this point. But this is potentially the source. So
yeah, it's hard. You can't even really call it a cliche when it's like that, right? It's everything springs from this. And speaking of springs from it, Disney as a corporation and as a major figure in the modern entertainment landscape, a lot of the success of that probably comes back to this film, right?
Oh, it definitely does. This formed the empire. This was it. This was such a huge deal for Disney. They bet everything they had, they put into this movie, and featured animated films weren't a thing. He was creating a feature animated film. People saw animation as cartoons and short form, and he took that to the next level and had it in color and had it, with amazing scores and it just took animated. I mean, every animated film that we see nowadays is completely 100% owing something to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Wow. Yeah, and that just also makes me think about when I was reading, and I'm curious to know if this happened to you too. When I was reading the story, I found several parts in there that were really reminiscent of other fairy tales. There was, obviously Sleeping Beauty is one that I always get confused with Snow White, because you also have a figure who is kind of a sleeping dead and then gets woken by a kiss. And I think is also in a glass coffin. There's a lot of these kind of carryovers.
I think Sleeping Beauty was in a bed when she was sleeping, but I get your meaning.
The other one is Goldilocks. When Snow White finds the cottage, the dwarf's cottage in the story, in the Brothers Grimm, she comes in and she's like testing everything out, and she comes and she tests the bed, and she finds one that's not quite right, and then she finds another one not quite right, but then she finds one that it fits her just right, and then she sleeps in that one. Yep. And it was very reminiscent, and especially the just right comment was very Goldilocks.
I definitely picked up on that.
So it's just, I'm wondering if they all owe DNA to the same story, or if it's like overlap, like there's a lot of these oral stories and there was like mix and match stuff going on.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It would take some insane research to figure out like which actually came first, and because like Goldilocks seems like an old story as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, who knows how old that is?
Yeah, and I should say that's a great segue to the caveat of we did not do as much research as could be done on this. This was a 1-week project for us, and we kind of got into it maybe thinking, oh, we can just tackle this, it won't be that big, and then tip of the iceberg was really all we were able to do. There are people who have devoted their careers to the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, to analyzing the way fairy tales and myths and legends throughout history change and morph and affect our culture. And there's just so much out there. When I was really starting to get into it, I was like, oh man, there's no way. We could do an entire series of episodes about this stuff and still only be scratching the surface. So full caveats of this is not going to be a comprehensive look at everything out there. If you want to do more research, absolutely, there is a ton of stuff out there.
Yeah, and that's not even to dig into all of the stuff that we're going to touch on some of it, but like the myth of Walt Disney and the way that the studio was formed after this. And this movie was the absolute monster hit of this generation. Like this was like the Star Wars of this generation. It's still like, I think with inflation, it's still like in the top 10 highest grossing films of all time. It's on like every list. Hold on, I have a thing here. In 1989, the United States Library of Congress deemed the film culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant and selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry. The AFI ranked it among the great 100 greatest American films and the greatest American animated film of all time in 2008. So it's like the amount of research that just the Brothers Grimm would require could be a podcast to its own, not to mention an entirely different Disney podcast. So we're definitely going to touch on what we can, and I'm excited to get into this.
Yeah, I think there are podcasts devoted to this, by the way. I mean, I have like vague memories of seeing them out there. I'm sorry, I don't know the actual names of them. I'm sure if you just search Brothers Grimm, you'll be able to find. But let's talk a little bit about the Brothers Grimm first, who they were, and then we can kind of move chronologically with the story, and then eventually we'll get to the Disney stuff. The Brothers Grimm are Jacob Ludwig Karl and Wilhelm Karl. They are German academics, philologists, cultural researchers, and lexicographers, and the authors who collected and published folklore during the 19th century. Included in their popularized tale of these old stories are Cinderella, the Frog Prince, the Goose Girl, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, Rumpelstiltskin, Sleeping Beauty, and Snow White. So just think about all those, right? Like that's it's a lot of the classic tales that just every child in America is familiar with, I would think.
Yeah, that's so mind-blowing. And I thought for some reason that Beauty and the Beast was a Brothers Grimm story, but I'm realizing that it was a French story.
Right.
But also, you can kind of see that Walt Disney and Disney as a company realized that these are great and prime for adaptations.
Absolutely. And I could go into their lives. There is some stuff known about them where they grew up in Germany. They were in a large family of 9 children, where a lot of these children died. 3 of them died in infancy, I'm seeing here. But I don't want to spend too much time just because it'll take up the time we can talk about other things. Eventually, they became librarians, they became authors, and they got interested in this stuff and started collecting it, which is how it was able to be remembered today. So, I think that's awesome. It's interesting. One of the things I want to go ahead and note is, actually, I'm seeing here Little Red Riding Hood is another Brothers Grimm. Well, yeah. So anyway, something I think is interesting is that in the original 1812 version of this story, the stepmother queen who orders Snow White to be killed by the huntsman was actually her biological mother. And they changed that in a later edition to make it more palatable for children of the day.
Interesting.
It's interesting, right? And I think that's an important thing to note with this story, is that because it's been adapted. I mean, how many times has this thing been adapted? 50 times more?
I can think of I can think of 4 or 5 right now, yeah.
Oh no, it's way more than that. I was looking at the list. There's tons.
Recently, yeah. 4 or 5, yeah.
Yeah, there's so many. And I think it's important to remember that with each iteration of this story, it's going to reflect the times in which it's being told often, right? You're going to see new perspectives put onto it to reflect culture at the time. And even in the collecting of these tales back then, they were already doing that, right? It was already considered a malleable story that can be changed and molded to fit what they needed to. So I think that's interesting to know. Originally biological mother jealous of her own daughter's beauty and trying to kill her. So that's pretty dark on just on the surface, right?
These older stories are also bringing to mind when there are tragedies or when they're something familial, something in the family. It reminds me of Greek mythology. The way that a mother is jealous of her daughter. It just sounds like something that would have been Greek mythology.
It's funny you bring that up. There has been some research into the scholars have often theorized about what the inspiration for this story was. There's from what I'm seeing, there's 3 main contenders. One of which I think is considered the most likely, but you did touch on another one, and that is the idea of. So scholar Graham Anderson compares the story of Snow White to the Roman legend of Hyon. I am far from 100% on the pronunciation. We looked it up. That's the best we could do. Recorded in Ovid's Metamorphoses. The name Hyon means snow in Greek, and in the story she is described as the most beautiful woman in the land, so beautiful that the gods Apollo and Mercury both fell in love with her. Mercury put her to sleep with the touch of his caduceus. That's the staff with the 2 entwined snakes. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but you know what I'm talking about, right? It's a modern symbol used today.
Yeah, it's a medical thing.
He raped her in her sleep.
Jesus
this
Christ.
was Mercury. Then Apollo, disguised as an old crone, approached her and raped her again. And here you go.
This is what I mean about being dark.
These affections led Hyon to openly boast that she was more beautiful than the goddess Diana herself, resulting in Diana shooting her through the tongue with an arrow. So there you go. There's the really old version of the story is she gets raped twice in her sleep and then wakes up and thinks that means she's more beautiful than a goddess. So that makes sense, right?
Yeah. Sounds like it wouldn't hold up in a modern sense.
Yeah. Like I said, this is a reflection of society, and I if that's true, then some of these stories are showing a society that not too pleasant to be reflected there. If you look at what the way women were treated, the values in society, and that's something that carries through to this story in these iterations we're covering, because beauty seems to be absolutely paramount. And not only that, it has to be like natural, like effortless beauty. And because the stepmother's described as beautiful as well, but she's not the most beautiful and she's jealous. And that is not good. You have to just be naturally the most beautiful and innocent and pure and not cunning and conniving. And so if you start thinking about what's the message here that we're conveying, right, it's not a particularly good one.
Yeah, I think that carries forward into the film adaptation as well. It's
absolutely
like what are little girls being taught by seeing this princess that they want to be, and that being their role model. And I think that Disney films have subsequently been addressing that in certain ways and trying to make their princesses have more agency. But yeah, this one is definitely one where you're kind of just like Snow White as a character. What would you say to describe her? Beautiful, and then like
I would say powerful woods witch who enthralls many woodland creatures and uses 7 dwarves to do her bidding. But we can get to that when we get to the animated film.
I'm excited to hear this take on it. Yeah.
But I wanted to back up. The other main inspiration of this, I think, is interesting. And if you like hearing me mispronounce words, then get ready, because I got some more for you. Karl-Heinz Bint Bartels, a pharmacist and scholar from Lorem, Maine, a town in northwestern Bavaria, found evidence that Snow White was Maria Sophia Margarethe Katharina, Baroness von und zu Urthal, who was born in Lohr in June 25th of 1725. I'm not going to pronounce it. I'm going to try and keep the names to a minimum after that, because that was brutal. Her father was a local representative of the prince. After the death of Maria Sophia's mother in 1738, her father remarried. The stepmother was domineering and employed her new position to the advantage of her children from her first marriage. A magic mirror referred to as, quote, the talking mirror, known as always telling the truth, can still be viewed today in the Spessart Museum in Lohr Castle, where Maria Sophia's stepmother lived. The mirror was presumably a present from Maria Sophia's father to his second wife. So yeah, that people think that is maybe the story. She was supposedly poisoned by the stepmother, and the fact that there was this mirror, this magic mirror, and this guy who produced mirrors and the manufacturer, people think that maybe that led to the Snow White story.
Wow.
Speaking of which, her gravestone was reportedly found in 2019.
Really?
Yes, the original, this Maria Sophia, her original gravestone. So there's a lot more to that I'm just scratching the surface there, but once again, that's just a taste.
So you were saying one of them seemed to you to be potentially the most correct, or one that seems the most real?
It's that one because of the mirror, specifically the mirror. So the other version was about a German story about another princess who got murdered by her stepmother, being poisoned. And that seems to be kind of like a woman getting poisoned by her stepmother, appears in a lot of different tales, but the mirror specific thing here makes it to me like the most likely direct descendant of this story, if that makes sense. Or antecedent, I should say. So that's the history behind it, or as much as I think we should try and get into here. Let's talk about the story itself, because let's just maybe give a rough outline of what happens in it, because it's mostly the same with some differences for sure. Snow White has a stepmother who's a queen, who's jealous of her beauty. She's described as being the fairest in all the land. I think it's interesting that the actual, and this is funny because I saw videos about the Mandela effect and how everybody says that they remember it being mirror, mirror on the wall, but that the saying is actually magic mirror on the wall in the film. Mm-hmm. In the story, it's mirror, mirror on the wall. So that kind of solves the mystery to me.
In the Brothers Grimm story that I read, it was looking glass on the wall.
Oh, interesting. Well, okay, I'm not sure which one you read then.
Like you said, multiple interpretations, translations, and everything.
Yeah. At least one that I read was mirror, mirror. So, but one interesting thing about looking glass, is that is just a translation thing, right? Like some word that means mirror was translated to looking glass rather than mirror, and then repeated twice. So essentially, that is still mirror, mirror, confirmed.
Yeah.
So it just depends on how it's translated. But that's an interesting. If you want to go down a rabbit hole, look up the Mandela effect and the Berenstain Bears and all that, and like how it's spelled and all this stuff. Like there's a lot of this. Oh, and like the movie was it Shazam starring Shaquille O'Neal
so I think it was Kazam, and everybody says it's Shazam, and it goes back and forth.
And it was Sinbad. There's supposed to be like a Sinbad movie with Anyway, look it up. Interesting stuff. But anyway, that is an aside. So she knows that Snow White is going to be more beautiful than her, and she can't stand it. And so she orders her death by the huntsman, who she sends out to kill her in the woods. He takes pity on her because she's so beautiful that he decides to let her go. And she wants him to bring back the lungs and liver of her to prove that Snow White's dead. He decides instead to butcher a boar and brings back the lungs and liver of a boar instead to the queen, and she eats them to celebrate, I guess, the murder of Snow White. So that was my like early dark moment there. We got some cannibalism here, or she thinks it's cannibalism.
Yeah, which is very like fairy tale. It's like something you would hear in a fairy tale. So
yeah, it
fits it. But I understand, Disney taking something like that out. And there's a couple of those moments where he takes things out or changes them in ways.
Yeah, and I think it's also like it's interesting that she's not really described necessarily as a witch, but she does appear to have a magic mirror. But she's not like casting spells and stuff in the original story.
But she does use witchcraft.
She uses poison. Yeah.
It said, well, at least in my translation, maybe it was different, but it said something about the reason that she was able to use that poison or whatever was because she was familiar with witchcraft or something like that.
Oh, I don't remember that part. It may be a difference in translations. It seems like maybe we read different ones. But maybe I just might misremember that. But regardless, there's not a lot of witchcraft going on. But I was thinking that she is very witchy, and witches were a huge worry around this time. And they were considered one of the most terrifying forces out there. And so when you have a witch character in a fairy story, she's not just kind of like a ha-ha witch. She's a dark, cannibal, black magic, truly terrifying presence, right? And that's what the stepmother is in Snow White. So you want to continue the story here? What happens next? Do you remember?
After she's left in the woods by the huntsman, she stumbles upon a small cottage and goes in, and we have our Goldilocks scenario where she walks in and she tries food as well, right? Food, yes. and then beds. Yeah. And then the dwarves return and find her in one of the beds, and they are shocked that it's a woman, right? Yeah.
And then she offers to keep house for them in exchange for being allowed to stay. And they agree to that. And then a series of attempts on her life are made by the queen, who finds out that she's still alive through the mirror. And the first time she sells her like a bodice that she puts on. It's like extremely tight and makes it hard to breathe.
The lace. Yeah, it's the lace.
She laces it up or something, and then like she almost suffocates to death, but then the dwarves find her and rescue her. And then she comes again later as like a different version of the old crone with a poisonous comb, which has a terrible, barely works, so ditch that idea.
I think they the dwarves find her and wash her hair or something, and she's fine.
Yeah. And then the apple. She finally comes with the poison apple, which is going to really do the trick. And dumb Snow White, who can't tell that this is a bad decision on the third freaking time, still takes the apple and eats it, and quote unquote dies, but isn't really dead, I guess, or maybe she is. I don't know. And the dwarves come and they decide she's so beautiful, even in death, they can't bury her. So they decide to put her in a glass coffin so that they can watch her forever. That's not creepy. And she doesn't decay, which is important to know.
They have one of the dwarves keep watch over her as the other ones go to work. Yeah. And it's they're kind of not worshiping her, but they're kind of just, I don't know, they feel like indebted to her, or they just love her so much because of
they
her
just love her
beauty.
because of her beauty. Everybody does who meets her. Like, that's why the huntsman spares her. That's why they allow her to stay. It's because she's beautiful. So just be beautiful is the moral of the story, and life will go your way. And speaking of that, the prince is the ultimate culmination of that. The man who shows up, he's a prince. He sees this dead woman in a coffin who's very beautiful, and decides, I'm going to take her with me. Now, I will say that at least in this version, he doesn't kiss her. In the version I read, he instead has his servants pick her up and carry her with him. He's going to take her with him as a possession, which seems weird in a different way.
Really weird, yeah.
Yeah, and then one of his servants trips on a stone, I think, drops the coffin, and the fall dislodges the bit of apple that was in Snow White's throat. She, I guess, coughs it up, wakes up from her slumber. Then the prince declares his love for her because she's so beautiful, and she loves him back, of course, why not? And then they go live in his castle, and then that's when the story actually gets dark. So in the castle, they decide they're going to have the wedding. They send out invitations all over the land, including inviting the evil stepmother, which, by the way, heavy Cinderella vibes with the stepmother thing, right? There's just a lot of that. The stepmother comes and is forced to wear iron shoes that have been heated up to red hot temperature in the fire, and she has to dance herself to death wearing these iron red hot shoes.
I was also noticing that the stepmother at first didn't want to go to the wedding. Like, she was like, I'm not going to that. She was so enraged and upset that first, Snow White is still alive, and second, she is getting married. And then she goes, and I think her whole ultimate goal is just to go and like make a fuss and like ruin the wedding. And when she gets there, they're waiting for her, and they're like, "Here, we have these steel shoes that are like heated up, and now you have to step in them and dance around." Brutal,
until you fall down dead. Which how does, I mean, foot burns that lead to death? That's some severe. I guess just the shock of it.
I don't know. Your feet melt off.
Yeah.
It's not I guess good. You just slowly melt. Yeah.
So yeah, that is the original Brothers Grimm version of Little Snow White. It's just interesting to me to think back about like why they told this story to their children back then. And maybe it did have some real world connections, but also it was just a fairy tale, and fairy tales usually are imparting some sort of wisdom or some sort of moral. And the moral here seems to be, first off, be God-fearing or God-loving, because Snow White is said to like thank God at one point or say her prayers.
Pray, and then she's praying or something.
Yeah, and then the godmother is described as godless, quote unquote. So I think there's a little bit of that going on. Doing your chores, keeping house, being if you keep house, then you get to stay with the men who do the work. I think there's something being said there. And then the idea of like, don't be smart, don't be cunning, be instead innocent and beautiful and dumb.
I would argue that like I think the major lesson here is just like the being wary of strangers, being wary of taking things from people, being wary of accepting gifts or something like that, because there's always something attached to that.
And also don't be jealous, and don't let jealousy drive you to try and do something that's gonna like get you killed, I guess. You know what I mean? Like from that point of view of like don't worry about being the most beautiful person in the land. So if you look at it that way, that could be a good lesson of like,
right. I have to be honest, a clear narrative story here for me is, and just in keeping with like the fairy tale idea and the classic nature of it, is the stepmother who is beautiful but cares so much about her beauty that she wants to kill Snow White should have remained the crone, the hag, forever, right? Like that just seems to me like another punishment. Like if she's stuck in that form,
she's got to wear burning hot shoes and melt her feet off and die. Come on,
right? But
this is 1812. It's brutal. Life is brutal back.
She's a witch. A witch.
Yeah, what do you do with a witch? You don't let her live. That's for sure. But I see what you're saying, man. But I think we got to get into this movie because I know there's a lot going on with that, and we can continue to talk about how the story evolved and changed over time. So, do you have anything else about the story specifically before we get to the movie? Yeah,
one last thought that I wanted to say, just because it's the fairy tale nature of this, and something with like the older stories like this, or like the rhyming in them and the repetition. is very apparent in the story, and it lends itself to like this sing-song sort of poem, epic tale that's going on here. The coming back 3 times thing is such a classic like fairy tale seeming thing, and as we'll see in the adaptation, unnecessary because it's the same thing 3 times, but there's something about it, the repetition, that like makes it
well. And that's a classic, like you're saying, an oral story. An easy way to remember it is like she comes 3 times and attempts to kill her, and the 3rd time is the one that's the most successful. And then, the mirror, mirror on the wall, that's like a touchstone for the audience. Like, oh, we're at this part again where she talks to the mirror, right? I think you're definitely onto it with like the way it's constructed to be something easy to remember for somebody who doesn't have it written down.
Exactly. So I just feel like that was something that Walt was thinking about going into the film as well.
Well, and also these darker moments to sort of defend our 1812 ancestors. I think some of that is like the shock and awe of telling a story to a group of people. Like, you want to have everyone go, oh, that's so horrible. Like, you know what I mean? And that's what you see.
They'll remember that, yeah.
Exactly. And you see that in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, like a lot of those old tales being so twisted and there's cannibalism and horror. And maybe that's just because those stories were memorable. And so that if you put in those like racy / just brutal and dark details, it's like, ooh, I can remember that.
Right, and it'll stick with an audience member, but specifically, it's going to stick with kids, right? Yeah. Like a child is going to remember that the witch who gets her feet burned for trying to kill Snow White.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so moving into this film, I feel like I've already talked about kind of the magnitude and like how important this film is, but just to talk about Walt Disney a little bit. Walt Disney was an animator from a young age. He really got into drawing. Eventually he would go and serve in World War I and then return, and with his brother would try to create an animation studio. And initially they got their start with a lot of short form trailer type things that you would see in front of movies back in like the 20s and 30s. These short form cartoons were where, Steamboat Willie was one of them. You would see the introduction of like Mickey Mouse and some of the other characters who are so massive now and so important to the Disney brand. But eventually he realized that there was so much more that he could do with animation than just having these short form 10 to 15 minute shorts that were comedic and they're always supposed to be very funny and you're not supposed to be connected to the characters anyway. And what he wanted to do with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was very specifically, he wanted it to take on a certain realism and a certain sympathy. He wanted the audience to take on a sympathy to the characters, have it stick with them in an emotional way. And I think that that's something that like carrying forward with all of Disney's movies, he realizes maybe with this one that the things that stay with people are the things that pull on your heartstrings or terrify you and all of that. So they used a couple of techniques to make this film, but the one that I want to talk about most before we jump into the actual movie. So animated films are made at 12, for the most part, especially in this time period, 12 frames per second. So every drawing that's drawn has to be meticulously drawn by an animator and then traced onto a cell, which is like basically like a piece of glass or plastic, and then painted over. And then once it's painted, put in with backgrounds, put in with all this stuff, and it becomes a cell. And then you film this, and that's 1 frame. So you do 12 times, and you have 1 second of animation. So that's just like the amount of work that goes into these is just unbelievable. And a feature film, animated film, hadn't been done like this before. So the amount of like manpower and time that was required, famously there's a lot of stories of like the overworking that had to be done by the animators, and Walt was pushing everybody. I mean, it's stuff of legend at this point. Like it's these people were like not sleeping, and at the same time he was having them take classes on photorealistic animation in ways that like if how your clothes move on your body while you're moving around. So he's pushing his animators. He's trying to turn this into a new art form where to get to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Like Snow White, for instance, is a very realish character. A lot of animation up to this point was what they call squish and stretch. So you'll have like the dwarves, for instance, are like a lot of squish and stretch. Their faces, the emotions that they make are really over the top. They do things that are like physically not possible in the real world. Sure. And then you have your characters that do abide by the laws of physics and nature and everything. So he's trying to push this forward with this film. To get back to the techniques that were used, they had something called multiplane camera that they were using. So basically they had sheets of glass that went up like 6 levels, and they would place the camera over top, shooting down into the glass. And on each piece, they'd be able to manipulate each layer at different speeds or in different directions, and it would give it this depth. So that's how you're able to take this like flat 2D image and create depth. A lot of the foreground and background has maybe like, there's the really famous shot where Snow White has gotten away from the forest that it's trying to pull her down. She's crying and all the animals come out. The foreground is blocked by some woods, and the background is very clearly separate. So you get a lot of depth. And that was a huge new technique that I think added a lot to this film.
Yeah. And
just one of many technical things that was implemented to make this movie something more than just a short 10-minute cartoon. So as I said, he was working on the sympathy. He was trying to have audiences connect with the characters. So he took the dwarves and he gave each of them their own identifiable characteristic, which I think clearly to this day was a good decision, because that's how people remember this movie, is the 7 dwarves, and each audience member may relate to one separately, and they're funny, and it's kind of like that vaudeville slapstick comedy of that time. How did you feel like that held up? Did you what were you into about this movie?
Well, first off, I was going to ask you which of these dwarves you were, but then when we were getting ready to record, you did a big old sneeze right at the start of the recording. So I think we've established that you are Sneezy the dwarf.
I think I have to be, yeah, at this point, right?
Yeah, and I feel like I'm either Sleepy or maybe Doc, because he he kind of fumbles his words a lot, and I feel like I do that sometimes on this podcast.
That's funny.
But I thought actually it was really funny. Grumpy, I wrote down I was like, oh, he's the internet. Because he's like,
I like that.
I don't like women with the females with their wiles. And they're like, what are female wiles? I don't know, but I'm again it. And he's just the whole time just like huffing and puffing, and oh, you're gonna be all mushy now, and like making fun of the other dwarves for giving in.
And yet, when push came to shove, he was waiting for that. He wanted the kiss on the head as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and the economy of the kiss is something that is definitely weird. We talked about this way back with like Howl's Moving Castle, remember? Because that kind of how that is at the end of that. But this was definitely, it was like Snow White was just throwing out kisses, and that was how she would reward these dwarves. I'm telling you, man, this I kind of want to give my outline of this movie, because watching it as an adult, it's changed for me a little bit.
Yeah. So I do think that there's something, you were talking about the economy of the kiss. I do think there's something to be said for quick displays of affection in a film like this, like moving things along. You can tell that Snow White cares about the dwarves, whether you're a kid or an adult, very quickly, because she's kissing people on the forehead.
Well, and you can also tell the dwarves are horny for Snow White.
Yeah, you're not wrong about that, but you got
Dopey coming back again and again and again, trying to get kiss on the lips, and she keeps doing the forehead instead. You know?
The way that Walt was able to take this story and condense it down, I think, is a much more palatable story, while also kind of extending certain moments to be memorable. I think making it a musical was definitely something, I mean, that carries forward till today. Almost every animated Disney film is a musical. I think that sticks with people, the idea of music, the way that music affects people. You're using all your tools when you're using music and film at the same time. If you see just the image, it's one thing. If you hear the music, it's one thing. But when you put those two things together, it's like magic sometimes.
It is magic. That is her magic, and she uses it on us as an audience, just like she uses it on everyone else in this movie.
I got to hear your version of this.
Okay,
man.
All right. Let me tell you what happens in this movie, just so you know. So we follow a young witch named Snow White with a stepmother who is another witch, who are going to come to battle each other. The first time we meet her, she's singing to pigeons and getting them to join in with her, and she's just kind of playing around with her magic. She's singing into a well. A man is walking by. He overhears her song and is immediately enthralled by her magic. has to come and profess his love to her, and she runs away laughing. The stepmother tries to get her killed. The huntsman takes pity on her, casts her out into the woods where she's terrified of all these animals until she realizes that her magic will work on them. So she starts singing at the animals, and soon enough she has the entire woodlands in thrall. And these animals, she commands them to take her to somewhere where she can find rest because she can't sleep on the ground like an animal. So they do. They take her to this cottage they know of. They go inside. She looks around. She finds it not to her liking. It's too dirty. So she starts singing a song in which she forces all of these animals to start cleaning this house, wiping their ass on things, licking plates. If you call that cleaning, then sure, that's what they're doing. So they clean the dwarf's cottage up, and then she finally goes to sleep in the bed upstairs. Okay, 7 dwarfs come home. Their home has been ransacked. Someone has come in and touched all of their stuff. Animals have been just sleeping in their beds, defiling all of their cookware and plates and all of that. They're terrified. The animals actually start playing pranks on them and making them even more afraid. Finally, they come to see Snow White sleeping in the bed, and they're just taken in by her astounding beauty. Still, they don't know if they want to let her stay. It's not until she starts singing at them that she really gets them under her thrall. And then all of a sudden, now they're there to just say, like, oh yeah, you stay with us and keep house, and then you can stay with us. But like keeping house for her, I mean, she has animals to do her bidding anyway, so she's not having to do any work. So she's got these dwarfs who are just completely enthralled by her as well. Now, the witch comes to kill her with the poison apple, and the animals who she has come and chase the witch off after she takes the apple and drive the witch up a cliff where she ends up dying, falling to her death. The buzzards descend on her and eat her flesh, we assume. And then her only problem is that she's kind of dumb. So once again, she eats the apple, and she's woken up by this prince who she had previously enchanted with her magic. And he kisses her, wakes her back up, and she's able to live happily ever after. So there you go, Snow White the Woods Witch.
So I think you got something there. I think you need to, and I think you need to make a little write up screenplay. Maybe send it in to Disney. See if they'll greenlight this, man.
Well, it's funny in a meta way. It works on us too because we're all taken in by this magic song. We just want to like her.
I mean, look with the films like Frozen and Tangled, Moana. Mm-hmm. These princesses have powers now.
They do.
I think they might be into this, man. I think this kind of fits in line with some of the animated films they're making now. So pitch the reboot, do it. Yeah. Maybe you might have to make it a little less dark, but I think they'd be into it, man.
I mean, I don't know how else to explain what happens in this movie, so I think it's the only way to read it at this point.
First off, I love your version of this, but I want to know just in terms of did it work for you in 2019? It's a 1937 animated film, first feature of its type. How does it feel to a 2019 viewer?
I think the power of cute animals is something that Disney learned in this movie. I think you're going to see Bambi come later. That feels like the same animals from this movie. Like everyone loves the animals who are helping her out, right?
Yeah, and Dopey flaps his ears around, kind of makes me think of Dumbo.
Well, he looks like a baby too. He's essentially a baby wearing oversized clothes, and he doesn't talk because he's an infant. And yeah, I mean the dwarves are cute. They're over the top. There's a formula here that they established that you definitely see repeated in other films that followed, because they learned that it worked here and that children liked it.
So, so how about in terms of the score and the hand drawn landscapes of and I think it is supposed to be German. It's supposed to be in keeping with sort of a German aesthetic as far as Walt was concerned. I think he wanted it to be like that, the original story. So how did those? Because I can remember us talking about Miyazaki and his landscapes, and his animation, and I just want to know what you think of the 1937.
I think most of it held up as far as the animation goes. I think Snow White herself is my least favorite character design out of everybody in the film. I think the dwarves are more interesting. I think the stepmother even is more interesting. Yeah, Snow White herself, I don't know. It almost felt rotoscoped. It was giving me weird flashbacks to that bizarre Lord of the Rings film we watched for our Patreon bonus episode.
Yeah. Well, like I said in that episode, this did use some rotoscoping. They
Okay.
used references more than rotoscoping.
Because it looked like her proportions were very normal for a person. And when
Right.
you're in a world where everybody else has these abnormal proportions, I don't know, it just felt weird at times. So yeah, I guess that would be my one minor complaint. The music is great. The songs are so classic. The hi ho, from work to home we go is how we first hear it, which I completely forgot that there was like a whole version where it was from work to home we go. And then later they reverse it, off to work we go, which is the more what everybody else remembers, I think. That song's so classic and iconic, right? These dwarves. I don't know, it's awesome. And when we first meet them in the mines, they have like a fun kind of interaction with all these little diamonds and stuff that they're collecting, and there's just a lot of great music and moments in this movie, for sure, and that holds up.
So I got to give least favorite character design to the prince, because he just looks, I'm just so forgettable. But
it's forgettable, so forgettable that I forgot to mention him.
Exactly, yeah.
You're totally right.
I do
completely forgettable.
I do like some stuff that they did with Snow White. Like, I think the character design in general is cool. I think that and I was reading about this actually. You know that like sort of like blushing. I don't know much about makeup, but it's like that reddish, almost like skin tone, like makeup look on her face.
Yeah, I think that's a reference to the story.
So when I was reading, I found out that they did all of the paint mixing in house. Like, it was all Disney chemists mixing their paints, and I guess someone along the way, one of the women, realized so Walt wanted her to like look more realistic, the flesh look more realistic, and one of the women who was also a painter realized that they could use some techniques to make it look sort of like blushing, like, and the legend goes that they used some of their own makeup. I couldn't find out if that was actually true or not, but that's like the legend, is like they use their own makeup.
I thought it was just a callback to the original story that had there's like actually, I'll just read the lines verbatim rather than butcher them. This is like an important bit for the name. I believe it's the original mother who dies before the stepmother comes in. She says she pricks her finger with a needle when she's sewing, and 3 drops of blood fall into the snow. And the red on the white looks so beautiful, she thought to herself, if only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood in this frame. Because she's looking at this thing, right? So that is how you get Snow White the name, I think, and that's what that's supposed to mean. And so the red, black, and white design of Snow White in the animation, I assumed was a reference to that line from the story.
And I think it very well might be. I think it was just a situation where Walt was like, I need this to be done, and somebody just figured it out, problem solved it.
That's cool.
I think this a couple things stand out to me in terms of like just like iconic moments and like huge, unbelievable shots in animation. The transformation of the witch, of the stepmother, where
that
she
was
like
cool.
that was really crazy, and the moving panels. That's a moment you can really see the different layers that they were dealing with there. Stuff's just so fascinating to me, and I just the idea of figuring all that out just seems like so overwhelming to me.
How cool was that potion spell? Like the spell she used to put that potion together when she was like using like the lightning to brew it, and the scream and the like all this different stuff, and the whole time the raven is like watching her and is terrified of her, which is like a great little animal companion, which becomes like a big thing for Disney, having these little animals.
Definitely. The other scene that I feel like you definitely appreciated was when she's running through the woods and all the trees are coming to life, the alligator logs.
What I like about that is it's such a subjective scene, because what they're doing there is they're showing you how her perception of the woods is that it's this terrifying place. And then after she falls over and wakes up, she sees it looks normal again, and she sees that all these eyes that she imagined as being so terrifying are actually these cute animals come out. So it's like it's a piece of subjective art being shown in this thing, which is, I don't know, it's cool to attempt something like that.
Yeah, and I love that, like you're saying, the trees, like when you're seeing them initially, they don't have the eyes on them, and the eyes appear as she gets closer to them.
Yeah,
it looked so normal before. The tree looked very normal, and then as she like gets closer to it and the eyes appear,
it morphs into Old Man Willow,
like creatures. Yeah, Old Man Willow, or like a tree, like an ant.
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly. So like the eyes just appear out of nowhere, and then it looks so like one of them looks like a crazy like mouth.
Yeah. And I feel like that became like an iconic sort of Halloween tree that I've seen I wonder if that was something that existed long before that or something, but the Halloween tree with the mouth and the eyes like that, just I've seen that so much after
and it's like the shadows, and it extends seemingly with the shadows and that kind of thing. Very Halloween, yeah.
I want to point out another moment where the queen who has transformed herself into the old crone is like laughing and going down the stairs, and she looks back over and she's like closing the trap door over her head. And I feel like I've seen this on the internet as like GIFs or something.
I think it's a meme. Yeah, I think it's a meme.
Yeah, like a meme. But it also reminds me of I think it's Evil Dead 2. Do you ever see Evil Dead 2?
Yeah.
They have this like
hatch
creature in the basement who is like kept under this hatch, and she like pops her head up and like says shit. And I
wasn't it? It was one of the people
scene.
turned in. One of the people that was there like turned into that, right?
I think you're right. It's been a while, but yeah, I think you're right. Yeah. Anyway, that reminded me of that. But then she goes down and she sees this skeleton of a prisoner apparently that she had in her basement, who died of thirst while reaching for a pot of water that was just like inches away from their grasp. And she taunts him and like kicks the bowl, and I was like, "What, are you thirsty? You want a drink?" So, I thought that was pretty dark for a Disney movie.
Yeah, definitely.
The guy died inches from the water he needed to survive. Right, assuming it's a man, but whoever it is, died that way. That's pretty twisted. And what about those vultures? I thought those vultures were going to help her out, but maybe they were under the thrall, too, of Snow White, because they were actually just waiting for her to die so that they could go to town on her corpse, I think.
Right, they were just waiting for their opportunity. I want to talk about the success a little bit of this film, because as I said, Disney, he bet everything he had on this movie. He put everything into it. I think at the time I heard that it was like $1 million production, which is pretty sizable production, especially because it's like, I think it's, it's post depression, but still like close enough to the depression to where it's like scary times for money. So $1 million and then $500,000 he had to be loaned by a bank who, after seeing a cut of the film, one of the representatives of the bank said like, this movie's going to make a ton of money. Yeah, you can have the extra $500,000 that you need. Got the film made. It went on to make an absolute absurd amount of money for the time. I think it said internationally made like $8 million or so upon its initial release, not counting anything else, any other releases. And then it went on to win the first ever animated Oscar. So literally an Oscar for animated feature didn't exist before this, and it was given to this as the first one.
Wow.
And really, really funny, the Oscar that they were given was one normal size Oscar with like a base on it, with attached to 7 smaller Oscars. So it's like the most interesting Oscar ever given out. It's like large and then 7 tiny ones cool. After it.
How about that? Once again, I mean, this is a story that reflected its times. This is not a very progressive time in America and around the world. And so you see that here too. This movie doesn't pass the Bechdel test, because even when the witch shows up to talk to Snow White, they have to make the conversation about men somehow. And so she tries to convince her to buy the apple pie because that's what men like. She's like, men will go crazy for this apple pie. And that is what makes Snow White want to buy it, right? Like, it can't just be like, this pie is going to be really good and you're going to like it. It has to be about a man. So I think that's, that's just how things were back then, which, like, I'm not trying to say that that's fine, because obviously it wasn't. And that's why we're changing it now, I guess. So,
right.
But I can also identify that is a product of the time as well. So seeing this movie and thinking about some of the like stereotypes that I know Disney is sort of guilty of putting into some of his films, it reminded me of something I came across in my research, and that's that Hitler was apparently obsessed with the original fairy tale version of this story. And I couldn't find whether or not, because at first I thought he was a fan of this movie, but then I saw later that he wasn't, because of the changes. It was like Americanized and modernized, and he didn't like the changes that were being made. So it seems more like maybe he was obsessed with the original version of the tale. But apparently it became a piece of propaganda that they actually used, and they demanded like everybody in Germany had to, read this story and be aware of it. And I assume it was cast in some sort of racial light. I'm not really sure. It seems like there's a lot more there to look into, and I didn't get into it enough to really tell. But
I wonder. So Yeah, what specifically spoke to him about the story, I wonder? Like, other than it's a German story.
Yeah.
Very, like...
Well, and it's about a Snow White perfect beauty, so that would probably
yeah.
appeal to, like, the Aryan bullshit
Right,
sensibilities.
racist, yeah.
And, like, wanting, like,
Yeah,
I think maybe wanting to poison someone for being pure, that kind of thing. Like, I can see that being some sort of part of the fucked up ideology.
I'd never heard that before. That's wild.
So what about the Disney stuff? I know you're saying that there's a little bit of he was accused of racism and stuff like that, and I don't know a lot about it.
Right. Yeah, I looked into it some, and you know, I think that, you know, rightfully so, there are things that are in the films that are not okay today, right?
Yeah, especially I know like Dumbo has some really bad stuff in it.
Right, and I mean, Song of the South in general is the one that, like, I don't even think Disney as a company like has that available for purchase anymore, because, you know, it's just very stereotypical characters in it, and I don't know. And what I could find, people were the evidence that they have is basically what he's put in the films, and I guess the counter argument to that, not that I'm making this argument. But what I've seen is people say that animation of the time tended to have a lot of stereotypes in it. So not saying it's right, but it seems like it was something that was done.
I always feel like that's kind of a poor refutation of anything. It's like, right. You know, someone's accused of doing something and then they turn around and go, well, everyone was doing it. And it's like, so I'm okay, you know?
Exactly. But like, I mean, how many movies have we watched where we've been like, God, this is not okay now? And it's just like, it's just kind of how society was. And it's been said, and obviously there's merit to it.
Yeah. Well, racism wouldn't be as pernicious a problem in our society if it wasn't able to affect everyone in a way. You know what I mean? And like, if it wasn't something that is pervasive in our culture and creeps into beloved, you know, stories. And I think that's something that, as I sort of got older and got outside of my bubble and started to learn about, and it's like, you start to realize that some of these things that you grew up loving have problematic shit in it. And it's because that people aren't aware of it, or if they are aware of it, they don't see the problem, or if they do see the problem, they don't care. And the problem is, it's hard to tell, or they don't think it's a problem. They want to actively put it out there. And it's very difficult to tell those things apart. Like, where does this come from? Does it come from ignorance? Does it come from active hate? Does it come from something else? And so it becomes difficult to identify. And yeah.
And that's like the institutional racism that we see.
Yeah.
It's just baked in.
Absolutely.
You know, there's situations where it's like you say, it could just be ignorance, but the problem is it's the people with the hate that are kind of leading that and keeping it.
Well, and regardless of the source, whether it comes from ignorance or it comes from hate, it still perpetuates it.
It's still racism. Yeah.
It's still racism. It still perpetuates it in our society, and that's why it's so important to identify it when you see it. And that's why I think it's something that we try and do on this podcast. Same with, you know, sexism, something that we try and identify when we can see it as two white straight dudes. So you know, which I'm sure we miss stuff all the time, but we try.
Yeah, for sure. So with all that being said, what is it, other than suppression of women, which is evident in you know, many of these older stories like this, what stands out to you as things that could have been fixed or probably have been in you know, retellings of the story?
Well, and honestly, you know, as much as I'm giving my tongue-in-cheek account of what happened, that comes a little bit from a place of wanting to give some more power and agency to Snow White, who is otherwise just floating around in this movie completely at the whims of everyone else and being led places by animals and completely helpless. You know what I mean? And so I think that's a way to recast this movie and give her some more power and agency. And
I want to say it has been done. Honestly, like, I think there was a live action. I haven't seen it, but there was a live action Snow White. And I'm sure that was, she was given a lot more agency, I'm sure.
Well, and we've talked about, there's so many adaptations, and there are going to be people listening to this who have probably seen all of them, or the majority of them, or a lot of them. And I have definitely missed a lot of the newer ones. So I'd be curious to know, though. Yeah, like, write us in, inktofilm@gmail.com. Let us know if there's like a particularly powerful adaptation of this material that you really like, the way it sort of reinterpreted it for a modern audience. I'd be curious to hear that for sure. But yeah, what about you? How do you feel about this movie and how it holds up for the modern day? And is it more just like a piece of history that's worth looking back at for that reason, or is it something that stands up today, you think?
Yeah, it's tough because it's like, as we've said, ultimately I think the story has sort of a meandering pace to it.
Yeah.
It kind of just goes along. It's taking you on a journey. I think it is very immersive. In terms of like we've talked about, I think the animation is absolutely beautiful. It is this like hugely iconic and hugely important film for animation. And we've said the things that don't necessarily hold up. We would like to see Snow White with some more agency for sure. But ultimately, I think it is. I still enjoyed watching it. I still, after I've seen this movie, I don't even know how many times. I would say probably like 5 or 6 times over the years. And every time I watch it, I appreciate something new. And it really, I mean, there's a reason, I think, why it touched this audiences at the time that it did. And it is like emotionally engaging at the end. When Snow, like I like seeing the dwarves cry specifically. You talked about how like they're very cute, and but that cuteness and that humor also kind of switches over to like emotion at one point. And
the animals outside in the rain who are maybe crying as well.
Yeah, and like I said way earlier in this episode, there's a reason why a lot of this stuff has continued, and like the emotion has been put into a lot of these Disney movies. They pull on the heartstrings because like, if an animated movie can make you cry, then they kind of did their job. That's kind of become the norm. Is like it really sticks with you if it makes you cry, I think, and that's something that they realized. And it's like cry. I'm sure people cry from joy from these movies as well.
Yeah. I think you're definitely right. You did remind me that. So I think I watched this movie a ton growing up. I think this is one of the ones that I would like play over and over again. That and Bambi. I really love Bambi. But watching it again this time, I realized like I didn't remember a lot of this movie. I think it's just the distance of time and not having a very good memory. Apparently I have a shitty memory. So watching this back, I was like, man, I didn't remember this part. It's definitely interesting to revisit, and a cool bit of history. And I think I kind of framed my question in a way that made it seem like the two answers were mutually exclusive. I don't think they are. I think you can watch this and enjoy it and still be enjoying it for the reason of like, this is an important piece of history that is worth revisiting and putting in context. Same with the Brothers Grimm fairy tale, going back and reading that and just knowing that that's where the story came from and tracing it all the way back to potentially a real person who was murdered, and then got her story told throughout time. I mean, it's wild to even think about that as being what happened, but maybe it did. I don't know.
I was reading that at one point there was, because they were working night and day to get this film done. Basically, they put themselves in a situation where they needed to release on a certain date, and it didn't leave them a ton of time. They had people working the cameras in order to get those shots, those frames to put together to create this film. The camera was running night and day, so they had like day shifts and night shifts. And as you see, if you look at like the IMDb of this film, there were like 6 directors with like 1 supervising director, and then everything went past Walt Disney. He had to see every frame before it was okayed. And just like just thinking about the number of people that came together for this, and it just makes me think of another thing I read was this film in the news and newspapers was being called Disney's Folly, because they felt that watching a colorful animated film was going to leave people with bleeding eyes, because it's a feature length film. They couldn't handle all of the colors. They needed to leave the theater. They couldn't watch that much.
Wow.
They wouldn't be engaged because they were supposed to be funny. And the amount of money that he was putting into this animated feature, it was all over the news. This is I think lovingly now people in Disney call this movie Disney's Folly as a joke, because it was his folly that became his greatest success and made the crazy empire that we see today.
Right, which, whether or not the existence of Disney as the empire we know it today is a good or maybe a bad thing, I think is another podcast. This was about Snow White. I had fun talking about it. It's definitely cool to revisit it. A little bit unusual for us, but if there are any other Brothers Grimm fairy tales or other fairy tales of any kind that have an adaptation and you would like for us to give the similar treatment, let us know, because I'd love to hear that. That's something we're open to doing more of if you guys enjoyed this version of Inktofilm. And yeah, otherwise we are going to be back next week with Stephen King, and we're going to be covering the original miniseries for It, and that's in preparation for It Chapter 2, which will come out with an episode on the following week. So if you're a Stephen King fan, your moment is coming.
Yeah, this is the full circle moment for the podcast. We're back to it.
Yeah. So excited to get to that, but yeah, I had a lot of fun with this, and hopefully you did too. All right, we wanted to thank one of our newer patrons, Simone C. Thank you for becoming a patron and supporting this podcast. If you would like to become a patron yourself, go to patreon.com/inktofilm, and you get access to our monthly bonus episodes, which we're going to be recording another bonus episode here soon. Actually, not sure what we're doing yet, but we're going to decide in the next day or two, and we'll be having that out soon. But I think we got like 16 of them out now. If that interests you, check it out.
Connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at inktofilm. And join the Council of Inklings. It's a great way to stay in touch and see what projects are coming up, be involved in polls that could potentially decide future projects. And we post all kinds of news that comes out in that. So definitely join the Council of Inklings.
Absolutely. And a way to help this podcast for free is to leave us a rating and review. We actually haven't gotten any new ratings or reviews on iTunes in a long time. I would love to see some new ones on there. They always make me smile. I like to repost them on our social media. So leave us one on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, I guess it's called now. Would love to see it. Otherwise, we'll take them on Facebook or wherever else you can post about us online. Always happy to see that.
Yeah, definitely. And tell a friend. If you're not going to leave a review, we totally appreciate just spreading the word just as much.
It's like in the meat space, giving the old verbal review.
Right. Word of mouth. Word of mouth is the best marketing.
Oh, we also wanted to thank Jennifer Delazana for providing our transcripts, and thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, Sleepy, that was fun. We're gonna.
All right, Sneezy.
We'll be back next week with it. We're gonna do the miniseries and then chapter 2 after that.
Tim Curry. I mean, everybody raves about his performance. I've only ever seen clips. I've never seen the whole thing. So we're definitely gonna weigh in on what we think of Tim Curry's Pennywise, and I'm excited for that. But until next time,
thanks for listening.